Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of World War II, and in fact, we have now come to the end of our discussion of the war and of our period 1920 to 45. And so in this final lecture, we will consider some of the legacies of the war, and in fact, some of the legacies of this entire period as we move forward into the next part of American history and world history, the Cold War. First, let's just review some of the results and outcomes of World War II. It was a horrible war in terms of total deaths, more than 50 million, by some estimates closer to 60 million worldwide, including both wartime casualties, combat soldiers, and civilians. For the United States, the death toll was over 400,000. And we'll reconcile some of this more in just a moment. As we've discussed in previous lectures, World War II and its productivity on the home front also brought an end to the Great Depression. It featured the introduction and development of many new technologies, most of them, of course, related to the war itself. We talked about such things as rocket technology and radar and sonar, but also something like television and early computers were being developed during World War II. It also, as I've described, introduced many new opportunities on the home front for blacks, for women, and other groups. While some of those were somewhat temporary, in other ways they also began to launch movements that would reach their peak in the 50s and 60s, the years after the war. World War II also meant a dramatic increase in the power of the President of the United States, particularly Harry Truman, who made perhaps the most momentous decision in the history of the world when he decided to authorize the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan. Never has one man wielded so much power as Harry Truman did in those moments. And finally, World War II, once and for all, brings an end to American policy of isolation and neutrality. As I mentioned earlier in the course, the United States after World War I retreated back to a stance of isolation and neutrality that prevailed throughout the 20s and through much of the 1930s. We don't do the same kind of thing after World War II. The United States is now one of the ranking superpowers in the world, and it would be impossible for the United States ever again to retreat to isolation. This is a chart that shows the overall commitment in terms of numbers of troops and also those killed in the war. And the most important thing to note is that the United States suffers a small fraction of the wartime casualties, particularly of a nation like the Soviet Union. And as we embark into the next phase of world history, the Cold War, we have to think about the different approaches in the aftermath of the war between the Soviets and the Americans. We were supposedly allies during the war, but clearly the Soviets had borne the brunt, and that was a scar that Stalin and the Soviets would take with them into the peace in the aftermath of the war. So let's talk about some of the legacies of the war and its lingering influence into the decades beyond. First of all, we would never again live in a world without atomic bombs. And perhaps one might speculate, had Truman not made the decision to drop the atomic bomb, that secret might have remained in Pandora's box, tucked away for many years to come. Or perhaps the bomb would have been unleashed at a different time and a different date. We can only speculate. But we know for sure that after the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there would never again be a world without the atomic threat. For a while, the United States would have the great advantage of being the only nation with atomic capability. But that advantage was short-lived, and once Russia attained the same capabilities, we would live in a world where mutually assured destruction was the key to keeping peace. So we need to think a little bit more about this. This was such an important development late in the war and beyond. we need to revisit this question. Was it necessary to use the atomic bomb? The atomic bomb was a strange new force. It leveled entire cities in a matter of moments. It was accompanied by a blinding light and also created its own wind, the atomic wind that if you've seen any videos of an atomic blast, it just blows down everything in its path for miles. And then there was the deadly radioactive dust that settled in the aftermath. This created a terribly destructive, awesome force that philosophers and religious figures debated for decades after the dropping of the bombs. So was it really necessary to use the bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, historians generally agree that Japan eventually would have surrendered anyway, and there's much debate as far as how long that process might have taken. How close were they to surrender even without the use of the bombs in 1945? Perhaps it would have been 1946, but with the Russians joining the conflict, it might have driven them to surrender a little sooner. Historians and those who've studied the documents of the day look back on Truman's advisors, American policymakers. What were they thinking at that time? In fact, the United States had intercepted Japanese codes in early July 1945, indicating that the emperor was ready to surrender, and so they suspected that the end was near. What about American military officials? Well, again, by summer, most military officials didn't think a land invasion would be necessary, that Japan was fairly close to surrender anyway. And Eisenhower was leaning in that direction as well. What if a land invasion was needed? Well, again, at this point, we can only speculate what the costs might have been. There were those at the time who feared that a land invasion of Japan would be far more costly in men and material than the D-Day invasion and the conquest of Europe. But others speculate that the invasion would not have been so costly, that in fact it might have simply been a tipping point, compelling those in Japan who were ready to surrender to take that step. In other words, it might not have meant Iwo Jima times 1,000 on the main island of Japan. So estimates from that time, documents from that time, estimate that about 25 to 45,000 American soldiers might have been killed in an invasion of Japan itself. This was far lower than some of the most exaggerated figures suggesting hundreds of thousands of American troops might die. So the intelligence that Truman was hearing suggested that Japan was close to surrender even without using the bombs. And yet he elected to use it anyway. So why did Truman use the bomb? We need to think about his mindset and the arguments going on in his own mind. And first of all, I would say that Truman did not take this decision lightly and that he wrestled with it. And we have some records, such as his diary, in which he expressed misgivings about the decision to use it. But why did we do it? Well, so for one thing, understand a little bit about Truman himself and his own personality. He was something of a small man and had spent much of his lifetime being picked on and insulted and looked down upon. And in fact, much of the American media was continuing to pepper him with insults even at the time that he was making this decision. This was in some way Truman's ultimate revenge against anyone who had ever picked on him and kicked sand in his face, so to speak. He's now the strongest man in the world. But there was also the real-world application of this, that he didn't want to appear soft, especially against a tough opponent like Stalin and the Soviets, whom everyone understood would now become our greatest rivals in the aftermath of the war. There's also a practical reality to this. I mentioned that for some, the atomic bomb was just the next logical progression of wartime weaponry. We've spent so much money, about $2 billion were invested in the development of the bomb. So why not use it? This is war, after all, right? All's fair in love and war. We've got this huge weapon, and we're going to use it. But I think the more compelling arguments begin to point us to the next chapter in world history, the Cold War. And Truman was already beginning to think in terms not just of ending the war against Japan and winning that war, but in terms of the next conflict, the rivalry with the Soviets. So by using the bomb, we strengthen our position against the Soviets. We show the Soviets that we have the most powerful weapon in the war. And just as important, we also, by using the bomb, we shortened the war. And one can debate whether Japan would have surrendered or when they would have surrendered if we hadn't used the bomb. But it's indisputable that the war was shortened by using the bomb. And importantly, in that context, it also weakened the role that the Soviets played. Remember when the Soviets joined the war against Japan? It was after the first bomb at Hiroshima, a day before the second bomb at Nagasaki. Effectively, the Soviets contributed nothing to the defeat of Japan. If we hadn't used the bomb and allowed the conflict against Japan to linger on for months or perhaps another year or more, the Soviets would have had to be credited with playing a much greater role in that ultimate victory. So, as it stands, the United States achieved the victory over Japan almost on its own, and thus had to give little to the Soviets in the aftermath. Well, we also need to talk a little bit about the shaping of the Cold War and what the world was going to look like in the aftermath of war. So, as our final contribution in this chapter, let's talk a little bit about the beginnings of the Cold War situated within World War II itself. It is within the Wartime Conferences that many scholars agree the Cold War originated. I've already discussed several of those conferences along the way, primarily meetings between FDR from the United States, Winston Churchill from England, and Joseph Stalin from Russia. Although we should note that it's Harry Truman, as American president, who attends the last of these conferences, the Potsdam Conference. Perhaps the most important in terms of shaping the Cold War is the Yalta Conference in February 1945. So keep in mind where we are in terms of the war itself. The D-Day invasion has happened. The momentum has turned. The Battle of the Bulge, in fact, is over. And so we're now in that final push towards Berlin, the race towards Berlin. And so the Allied leaders are meeting at a time when the defeat of Germany is imminent. And now it really is a question of what is Germany going to look like in the aftermath? What is the world going to look like in the aftermath? And so there are a number of important decisions reached at Yalta, including the idea that Germany would be divided. And in fact, it would be divided amongst four Allied powers: Britain, France, the United States, and Russia. Eventually, those four divisions would be whittled down, but that's for a later course. The capital city of Berlin was also divided into four quadrants, which would eventually be whittled down into two quadrants. And again, that would have real-world consequences during the Cold War, during what's known as the Berlin Airlift. Again, a discussion for another day. It was also at Yalta that it was agreed that the Soviets would be able to control Poland in the aftermath of the war. Now, FDR has taken a lot of heat from many historians and some at that time for surrendering Poland to the Russians. But we do need to think about the realities of the situation. For one thing, the war was not over yet, and particularly the war in the Pacific. Part of surrendering Poland to the Russians involved their promise to join the war against Japan and to help defeat Japan once the war in Europe was over. We've already talked about how some of that carried out. But FDR did want to secure Russian aid in that process. And we should also note that in real-world terms, the Red Army already controlled Poland. There was going to be no way for the Americans or other allies to pry the Soviets out of Poland after the war was over. And so in some ways, FDR wasn't giving up anything here. It had already transpired. 2 months after the Yalta Conference, on April 12, 1945, FDR died. And the new president was Harry Truman. Truman asked Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's widow, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And she responded, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." Now, of course, we've talked about Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb, which was one of the most important decisions ever made, and certainly one that he wrestled with early in his presidency. But he also had to deal with this growing Cold War and the relationship with Stalin and the rest of the Allies. In July 1945, the Allied leaders met one last time in Potsdam, Germany. And this time it was Truman squaring off with Stalin. Here the Allied leaders agreed that Japan would be required to surrender unconditionally. They talked further about the division of Europe in the aftermath of the war and confirmed some of the decisions reached at Yalta. But almost as important as all of that was the fact that it was at the Potsdam Conference that Truman received word of the testing of the atomic bomb, and so he understood that they now had the bomb. He told his ally Winston Churchill about the bomb. He didn't tell Stalin, only suggesting that there was some new weapon on the way. But Stalin, by virtue of intelligence, already knew about the atomic bomb. And so it just planted a seed of distrust in his mind that Truman would not share the news that he already knew from his own intelligence. The Soviets would never again trust the Americans as they had during the war. And so the most stark realities of the post-war world set in. It was to be a world divided, increasingly along allegiances either to the United States on one side or the Soviet Union on the other. It was a world dominated by the reality of the atomic bomb. Never again could we sleep easy at night without fear of an atomic attack that might destroy the world. And it was a world of different ideologies and divided ideologies. The Cold War, which fell across cultural lines, economic lines, social lines, religious lines, and so many others. And so, at the end of the day, not long after the conclusion of World War II, we are left with a situation aptly summarized in this cartoon. The world teetering between control and destruction, and everything resting on the uncertain fate of the atomic bomb. Well, this is a reality to be discussed another time in another course, and perhaps you'll join me for the next course on the Cold War.